Let's head to the West Australian, Scott Emerson. Now, of course, we know that the Prime Minister Scott Morrison is in Washington as we speak, as is Paul Murray, who, of course, will be reporting live from Washington for the next 3 or 4 days. Why the PM's trip to meet Trump comes with excess baggage. An exclusive here by Lanny Scarr. The Prime Minister has been warned to mind his language during his week-long visit to the US so as not to provoke Chinese anger and disadvantage the economy on the eve of Morrison's historic trip, during which he will be honoured by Donald Trump and inspect a cardboard factory owned by Richard Pratt. Business leaders say just one misstep could have diabolical consequences for Australia's trade relationship with China. And, of course, it comes off the back of Kerry Stokes imploring Morrison or at least his senior cabinet people to go to China and have some dialogue with the Chinese. It's an interesting take on this, isn't it, Scott?
Look, we're quite rightly so. And it was interesting to see that story in the Weekend Australian about Kerry Stokes, calling on Morrison and senior members of the government to go to China to try to heal the relationship with China. There's been accusations almost in WA, particularly of a China club in WA. The Chinese, the economy over there is very dependent, obviously, on the mining sector, and particularly in terms of relationships with China. So you can understand this story coming out about saying to Scott Morrison, look, be careful what you say. But we all know that probably the dominant issue to discussion when Scott Morrison is in Washington will be China, that relationship, the trade deals. But it's interesting to see these concerns being raised, particularly out of WA, by business leaders about making sure we try to mend the relationship with China rather than exacerbate the tensions already there. I don't know if Scott Morrison is going to be particularly listening to that. Obviously, he doesn't want to make the relationship anything worse, but I don't think he can make a reverse on terms of the concerns he's raised regarding Chinese influence, and particularly in terms of Huawei, in terms of security and those kind of issues. It will be very interesting to see what Scott Morrison and Donald Trump do talk about, particularly after their meeting, in terms of China and that relationship going forward.
Well, Matty, you're in the top end, and of course you're closest of anyone to what's going on in the South Pacific there, and of course we know that the Chinese have been voracious in their appetite when it comes to infrastructure spending in places like the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, those sorts of areas, and I'm sure that will be a topic of conversation when the Prime Minister meets with Mr Trump.
Yeah, they might also talk about the fact that the Chinese company Landbridge has got a 99-year lease over the Darwin Port, Gleeso, so that's something that's come up in conversation between Australian Prime Ministers and US Presidents in the past as well. But I think that people in the Northern Territory, I think, share some of those concerns Scott was talking about then about that are coming out of Western Australia. I mean, here in the Northern Territory, I think 37% of our exports go to China. If that was cut off overnight, our parlous economic situation here in the top end would become a full-blown crisis pretty quickly. It was interesting, that story you've both been talking about too, that was on the front page of the Weekend Australian. Now, it was also saying that it wasn't beyond the realms of possibility that China could go to a country like Brazil and say, OK, we're going to do a deal with you. We're going to start buying, your iron ore, in massive quantities, and that could have massive ramifications here in Australia as well. So I think that we're right in Australia to be mindful of what's going on in China. I think we're absolutely within our rights to call out China when it comes to human rights abuses or things that go against the rule of law, as the Foreign Minister Marise Payne did recently in regards to that Australian citizen who's been detained in China. I think absolutely Australia should hold its ground on those issues. But I think also there is some merit to the argument that we need to be careful, not to go and sort of overblow the whole situation and risk really upsetting China, because Australia has a hell of a lot at stake here.